What's up, everybody? Michael Walsh here. So I've got a fan-requested topic today. It's from my man, Dale Gribble, one of my most steadfast subscribers and commenters. He requested a Fighter of the Year video, so here to give it to you. I'm going to look at kind of the entire, men's champions and former champions, as in guys who, were champions this year and lost their belt. I'm going to kind of run through all of them. I'm going to broadly go from least deserving to most deserving and ultimately make my argument for, the top two guys and declare my winner, declare who I think is Fighter of the Year. So, starting at flyweight, I'm going to look at Pantoja and Van, because this is an interesting one. Pantoja had two fights this year. He beat Kai Kara-France, which was a very good win, got the finish. It was arguably a tough stylistic matchup. Some people were picking France to win. They were picking him to win by knockout. It was a very good win for Pantoja as far as winning over the fans and pundits. He'd been doing that. I think the Asakura win actually did quite a lot to help him on that front. But I think with the win over France, that really kind of silenced the doubters and silenced the critics and really got people to maybe not hold him on the level they were holding guys like Merab and Islam, but nevertheless hold him, at appropriately high standards, I think, and recognize what he was doing. Some people overrate him. Some people still think he was better than Mighty Mouse, which is fucking nuts. But anyways, not to go on yet another tirade about that, but you'll get that later when I finally do my top 20, my revised top 20 GOAT list in a few weeks. But, and more on that later in this video as well. But in any case, the win over Kai Kara-France did a lot for Pantoja. It's a good win. But he then goes on to lose to Van. Now, I'm not going to count that loss very much, and I'm not going to count it very much as a win for Van either. But even if you don't count it at all, even if you just treat that fight as if it never happened, having one win over Kai Kara-France is just not that great. It puts Pantoja somewhere near the bottom as far as the current and recent champions having an argument for being Fighter of the Year. With Van, he has a better argument in the sense that, he's 4-0 this year. Having 4 fights and 4 wins in 1 year is crazy, kind of regardless of who those wins are against. He has one pretty good win over Royval. That's arguably as good as Pantoja's win over France. And yes, he beat Pantoja. And if we're going to count that fight as anything whatsoever, you of course have to count it favorably for Van and unfavorably for Pantoja. But I count it for next to nothing because it's Pantoja effectively slipped on a fucking banana peel 10 seconds into the fight. We learned basically nothing. You could even argue Pantoja was winning the first 10 seconds of the fight. So, not going to count it for much. So that mostly just leaves us with the 3-fight win streak, which is okay. It's good. The fight with Royval was excellent. I think he deserved a title shot reasonably enough. Did Van, but if you remove the fact that he beat Pantoja and won the belt, if you just remove that from the equation, all of a sudden this just kind of looks like any run-of-the-mill Donald Cerrone, Neil Magny kind of year, where they have a good year where they're very active and they put together a good win streak, they don't lose. Kevin Holland has had years like that. That. It's just not that. It's not bad or anything, but it's just not. That's not the kind of thing that actually gets you Fighter of the Year. So, both Pantoja and Van, they're somewhere nearer the bottom. Another guy who's actually lower than them, of course, is Tom Aspinall. His only fight this year was against Cyril Gane. Doesn't even go the first round, ends in a no contest. Gane is arguably winning the round up to that point. Just a terrible year for Tom Aspinall. So he's, of all the sitting champions and former champions, he's actually at the bottom. But after him, we probably have Alexander Volkanovski. His only fight this year was against Diego Lopez. And, that was a good win, especially when you consider Volk's age and the stage of the career that he's in. Wouldn't be as good of a win had it happened during his initial title reign, but winning the belt, even a vacant belt, but winning a belt back at his age against a guy like that, very impressive. And he comfortably won. He largely schooled Lopez. He, of course, got dropped. I think it was at the very end of the second round, but he gets dropped at one point, and that's a bad look. But, aside from that, it's just all Volk all the time. It reminds me a lot of GSP's win over Carlos Condit, where GSP just like wins the whole fight effectively, but Carlos Condit at one point lands a head kick and drops him. And even there, it like looked even better for GSP because he goes on to win the rest of the round. That happens like midway through the round rather than at the end of the round. But nevertheless, very comparable fights, very comparable wins for Volk and GSP. And since Volk, again, did it later in his career, all the more impressive. But that's it. That's all he did this year. He had that one fight. And great win or no, old man or no, it's just not enough. And especially when Lopez was like an okay challenger, an okay candidate, but like he wasn't the most deserving. It wasn't like he fought Evloev, he was more deserving in the first fight, was Lopez, than he will be in this stupid fucking rematch they're doing. But nevertheless, like, to have the one win, this year and to have it not be against the actual top contender in your division, it hurts your argument. So Volk's around there. And after him is probably Ilya, another guy who only had one win this year. A good win over Charles, but, Charles is old, frankly. Charles was not the sitting champion. Yeah, it's a good win. He did okay on the ground for a little bit and then knocked his ass out and, like half a round or something. And that's all great. But again, like when it's for a vacant belt, when it's not, it's not even against the top contender. He didn't do it against Arman. When Charles is old, and once your only win of the year, like, it's only so strong an argument. And it's like a little better than the win over Lopez probably, but, it still puts you in that sort of bottom half of the conversation. After that, we've got Khamzat Chimaev, another guy, only one win this year, some inactive champions, I hate to say it, but his win over Dricus is very good. Okay, like it was a boring fight, and I stand by that, but it was insanely dominant. So dominant that you almost hold it against him because it revealed actually, some very serious flaws in Dricus's ground game, at least his bottom game. It's somewhat reminiscent of like when Khabib beat Justin Gaethje, where it was like, Jesus Christ, I didn't know Justin Gaethje was this bad at jiu-jitsu. It's kind of similar in that way. But nevertheless, it's a very good win. I think it's a better win than Volk's win over Lopez or Ilya's win over Charles. Not because Dricus is like a better fighter than Charles Oliveira, but again, Charles was older. He wasn't the sitting champion. Dricus was coming off a very good win streak over very good names. Sure, some of them over older guys, but nevertheless, like very good wins, very good names. 2 title defenses. MMHA put out a video recently, like kind of his updated GOAT list, and he has a kind of weird idiosyncratic criteria, but he had Dricus on the list because he was kind of arguing from a point of view of like who's the best and most effective. And by that, he kind of meant like basically his argument was, despite the fact Dricus got totally hosed by Khamzat, he was basically arguing that Dricus would beat every other middleweight to ever live. Like he would pick him, obviously against guys he's beaten like Strickland and Izzy and Rob, but he would also pick him over guys like Anderson Silva and etc. So he was like, well, he may have gotten comfortably smashed by Chimaev, but Chimaev's like the only guy who can do it. So and there's an argument there. And for that reason, I bring that all up because that just shows that the win over Dricus for Khamzat is a very good win. It should be ranked very highly relative to these other guys who only have one win this year, just like him. So again, I place that a little slightly higher than I place like Volk's win over Lopez and Ilya's win over Charles. I put Chimaev right around there. And the next one, similar, but you would think superficially actually worse off, is Alex Pereira, because he also only has one win, but he also has a loss, because his 2 fights this year were both of the Ankalaev matches, where he loses the first one, wins the second one. But I would actually rank him higher in the Fighter of the Year discussion than I would the previous guys I mentioned, especially, Volk, Ilya, and Chimaev. I think like people don't appreciate just how fucking good the Ankalaev win is. And I'm going to touch on that more when I do my GOAT list video, again, in a few weeks. I touched on it immediately after the fact. I had actually picked Ankalaev to win. I thought Alex was too old and that this is just not the kind of fight people win. But he shocked me because he did something that is pretty much unprecedented. Because bear in mind, Alex Pereira is 38 years old. He was 38 years old going into going into that fight. And even at like heavyweight, that's still pretty fucking old. And this again is just not the kind of fight anyone wins. Like, we have other examples of good champions who finally take on some surging contender who has to put together 1 million wins to get their title shot. They lose to that guy, then they have an immediate rematch, and they just never win that rematch. Like, consider Kamaru Usman versus Leon Edwards. You know, and the first like loss was actually a rematch because he had beaten Edwards when they were both contenders, but Usman is this reigning champion. Edwards puts together this massive unbeaten streak, gets his shot, beats Usman. They have an immediate rematch after that, so a trilogy fight. And Usman loses, you know? Or consider, like, Jose Aldo, Max Holloway. You know, Max Holloway has to, like, clear out the division effectively before he gets his title shot. It's very similar to what Junior Dos Santos had to do at heavyweight to get his shot against Kane. But anyways, Jose Aldo loses, has an immediate rematch with Holloway, and of course loses again. Because even in the Kane fight, because you might say, like, well, that's an example, because Kane got his belt back and, like, won the trilogy. But even there, Kane had a fight in the interim. He had to fight Bigfoot, you know? To just go right back into the guy who just beat you, that's usually not good for the guy who lost in these situations. Or look at Anderson Silva. You know, it's not quite the same thing because the win streak's on his line, but it's an unbeaten guy on a very good streak who's looking great. And Chris Weidman, who comes up, he beats Anderson the first time. They have an immediate rematch, and of course what happens? Weidman just beats him even worse in the rematch. Kind of the same thing with like TJ Dillashaw, Renan Barão. And I think Barão actually got another fight in between there. Got a win in before they had the rematch, I believe. And same thing though, he just gets smashed. And again, it's not totally apples to apples because TJ Dillashaw is like a unique talent and he didn't have to put together that same win streak. But just look at other guys who did put together that win streak where the champion didn't get the rematch, but like we can just imagine how it would go. So like Tyron Woodley lost his belt to Kamaru Usman. Kamaru Usman was on a 9-fight win streak, you know, like overdue for a title shot, smashes Woodley. They didn't do a rematch, but like, what do you think would happen if they did? Just knowing what we know about both guys. Even Charles Oliveira and Islam Makhachev. Islam Makhachev had to win 10 fights in a row to get his shot. Pretty comfortably beats Charles, and I know Charles has fans and standouts, you know, or fans who would stand by him, but like, nevertheless, I think most of us would pick Islam to win even more comfortably in a rematch. You know, that's just kind of how it is. And so for Alex Pereira to lose, you know, not the most like lopsided loss in history, but to lose pretty clearly to Ankalaev, you know, I know the fight was kind of close. I know it was technically a split decision, but I think most of us recognize that Ankalaev, while it was kind of close, he still clearly won. You know, so for Alex to pretty clearly lose to this guy who appeared to be a very challenging stylistic matchup for him to lose at that age against that guy on that kind of win streak, and then come back in the rematch and smash him in a way that didn't seem fluky. Like, I know it was short, but like, he did things to set it up. You know, he was working the legs, he got him to switch stances, and that was, you know, what he needed so that he could exploit his weaker defense on that side. Like, it played out very quickly, but that looked like the product of a game plan. That didn't look like he just bum rushed him the way like Francis Ngannou bum rushed Rosenstruck, or the way back in the day that like Brett Rogers bum rushed Andrei Arlovsky, and just where they both get a knockout in like 20 seconds. Like, because you can do that. You can just surprise someone by coming out immediately and just and just like pump punches at him, and like one of them catches him. That can happen. That can backfire, just like a James Thompson versus Alexander Emelianenko, where he does that. It kind of surprises Emelianenko, but he doesn't get put away right away, and he covers up and starts throwing back, and you know, he has his wits about him, and he actually catches Thompson in one of the funniest and most iconic old knockouts in MMA history. But all that to say, that's not what Alex Pereira did. Alex Pereira came out intelligently and systematically broke down Ankalaev and just got a very quick finish. And again, to do that against that kind of guy at Alex's age, it's fucking nuts. It's absolutely nuts. And for all those reasons, I think despite the fact he also only has one win this year, and unlike the others, he actually has a loss this year, I still put him higher than I do Chimaev, Ilya, and Volk in the Fighter of the Year debate. You know, I simply do. But I don't put him that high because we still have a handful of fighters to discuss who have much stronger arguments and who are actually the contenders for this award. So one of which is Merab. Now, had Merab not fought Peter Yan and lost, he probably would have won. I probably would have given it to him. I probably would have given it to him over Islam. However, he still lost, you know. And sure, you can maybe say he's getting up there in age. He's 34. You can maybe say it was just too many fights too often, too much weight cutting, etc., etc. You know, 4 title fights in 1 year, it's too much. Just look at what happened to Ranier de Ridder. You can make that argument. You can kind of cushion, you know, the blow a little bit for Merab. But nevertheless, he did lose. And he did lose to a guy who seemed to have the solution to him and the solution to his game in Peter Yan. So you can't put him at number 1, and you can't put him over Yan. Because, and it's not like you can't ever be ahead of someone you lost to in a discussion like this, because let's imagine a different scenario where, like, Yan was on a losing streak. Like, let's imagine Yan lost his last 2 fights against whoever, but let's imagine he had lost his last 2 fights. Let's imagine Merab was supposed to fight someone else. He was supposed to rematch Umar or something like that. And his opponent got hurt, and let's imagine Yan was a short notice replacement. Not unlike Moicano stepping in for Arman against Islam. Not unlike, you know, maybe a better comparison, like Bisping stepping in on short notice against Rockhold. Like, let's imagine that was the scenario, and let's imagine Yan won. And let's especially imagine he won in a way that was a little more fluky. Like, let's imagine Merab was doing Merab things, but then in round 2, he got caught by a knee or something and got knocked out. If that happened, I'm not putting Yan ahead of Merab in a Fighter of the Year debate, because it's like, I'm still not convinced you're the better guy. I'm still not convinced Merab doesn't beat you 9 out of 10 times. And his 3-1 record this year is just better than your like 2 or your 1-2 record. Okay. You know, hypothetically. In that scenario, you know, I would have Merab ahead. But in this actual scenario we find ourselves in, where Yan has 2 wins this year, Marcus McGee and Merab, and he's got a win streak building up to that, you know, the year prior, where that's the case, and where his win over Merab is such that it makes it appear that he is just the better man now, that he has solved the Merab puzzle. In that case, you just can't have Merab ahead of him. And so it really just comes down to Peter Yan versus Islam Makhachev for the Fighter of the Year debate. And for the 2 of them, it's tricky because they have like kind of a similar year. They both have 2 wins, and they both have 1 kind of middling win and 1 insanely good win. Because Yan, like I said, he beats Marcus McGee, who is ranked something. He was like top 15 or maybe borderline top 10. I can't remember. I'd have to double check. But something like that. And then he has this amazing win over Merab. Islam has this win over Moicano, who again was like fringe top 10 and was a short notice replacement guy, was not the actual top contender. Beats him more decisively than Yan beats McGee, granted, but nevertheless, similar opponent, similar win, and then he has this insanely good win over JDM where he achieves double champ status. So there's a few ways to look at this, because I do have Islam ahead of Peter Yan in like my own kind of pound for pound list, and I do have him ahead on the GOAT list. Now, prior to beating JDM, and prior to Merab losing, I actually had Merab ahead of Islam on both. Like, I had Merab as the pound for pound number 1, personally, and I had him ahead on the GOAT list, because if you go back, you know, to the GOAT list video I made over the summer, I had Islam only at number 9, and I had Merab at number 6. So, and granted, that's having Islam a lot lower than a lot of other people had him at the time, and I now, of course, have Islam much higher, and have him higher than I have Merab now. But nevertheless, at the time, that's where I had it. And Islam's win over JDM has done a lot for him. I do currently have him as the pound-for-pound number 1 fighter. And I'm not going to spoil where I have him on my GOAT list, but I'll just say it's a lot fucking higher than 9. And that's all well and good, and that is a pretty strong argument for him to be Fighter of the Year. However, with Peter Yan, it's an interesting story, because his career is kind of weird, and his achievements as a champion are kind of weird, because to like go down memory lane a little bit, he wins a vacant belt against Jose Aldo. Jose Aldo didn't really deserve the title shot. He fought very well in that match and sort of showed in that moment that he deserved to be there, but going into it, he definitely didn't deserve it. Jan looks great. He gets a finish, and yeah, he looks the part. Goes on to lose by disqualification to Aljamain Sterling in a fight he's largely dominating. Loses his belt. Wins an interim belt against Corey Sandhagen. And it's a competitive fight, but Jan clearly wins and shows he's better. And, that's why we were all accounting Sterling out in the rematch. But nevertheless, he loses in the unification fight against Sterling. And it's a split decision, and I think it went the right way, but I still left those two fights thinking Jan was the better man. And then he, of course, has his, following losses and then win streak, and now he's won the belt back. So it's wins a vacant belt, no defenses, loses by disqualification, wins an interim belt, then fights for the unification, loses, few losses, win streak, and now wins the belt back again. So he's a two-time champion. Very interesting spot. Again, not as high as Islam on the pound-for-pound rankings and certainly not in the GOAT list, but I think this win might have done more for him, though, because I didn't have Peter Yan even on my top 20 GOAT list over the summer, whereas now he's on it, and he's kind of high. I mean, he's not as high as Islam, but he's kind of high. And, and Merab simply is a better win than JDM. I mean, JDM didn't really deserve his title shot against Bilal, and it was the sort of fight where you're watching it and you're like, I'm just not convinced either of these guys are the best welterweights in the world. And yes, it's still a good win for JDM. He was on a good win streak, not just in the UFC, but collectively. He was on like an 18-fight win streak or something. Just MMA record-wise. Yeah, that's all well and good. Yes, he's one of the top welterweights, so that is a good win, of course, for anybody. And yes, it's amplified because Islam had the size disadvantage, so him beating JDM counts for more than it would have like Ian Gary beat him, or if Shavkat beat him, or if Morales beat him. But nevertheless, beating JDM, even with a size disadvantage, I simply don't think is as good of a win as beating Merab. And, to beat Merab so decisively, so comprehensively, with such a perfect game plan, in a way that, again, will transcend any arguments we make down the road about, the state of Merab's career or anything. It just speaks to the quality of Yan. So Yan, all of a sudden, is, in my book, very high on the pound-for-pound rankings. He's not as high as Islam, but he's very high, because it really cemented what we always believed about his skill set anyways. So, all of this is to say, I am giving my own personal Fighter of the Year award to Peter Yan and not to Islam Makhachev, because, again, I think whilst Islam is on the better win streak, whilst Islam is higher on the pound-for-pound list, whilst Islam is higher on my own GOAT list, nevertheless, I think this year did more for Peter Yan and for his career than this year did for Islam. And I think the wins, specifically the two important wins, the win over Merab, the win over JDM, I think of those two wins, beating Merab is the better of the two. So, what can I say? I think Peter Yan is the guy. He is the Fighter of the Year. And there's your video, Rusty.